Hey everyone, welcome to the This Week I'm Into podcast. This week we are chatting about zoning and urbanism with our mutual friend Tyler Labiak. I will say this was a little bit of a tougher one. I'm here with my friend and co-host, Paul Imbruglia. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing great this week. How are you doing, Hans?
I'm doing good also. I just described this as tougher because out of the topics we've covered so far, I would say this one is the one I knew far and away the least about.
I would agree with you that it's definitely harder for me to understand, but I think I was most surprised about what I learned, I guess is the best way to put it.
Personally, I did not have a great or a lot of experience with this, but I'm curious to hear, do you have any experience with zoning or urbanism?
Yeah, the answer is no. In my free time, I watch a lot of like informative YouTube videos, and I had definitely seen a couple from Vox on, I would say, things that are like very related to this topic. So there was like some things on biking lanes and some things on like parking spaces that I had like heard of before. And so when we were like doing this topic, I went back and watched a couple of those. But that's definitely where I started, and that's really all I knew.
Yeah.
Before Tyler had even brought it up.
I kind of retroactively looked back to see where I could have experience with zoning and urbanism, and obviously cycling is a huge part of that also. And I kind of came up with two things. And I will say my experience is very limited, but as you know, right now I'm living in Chicago, and the most I know, the most specific thing to urbanism I know from Chicago comes from the architecture boat tour, which if you don't know is always pretty famous, but like it's, you go through Chicago on a river on a boat, and as you're going through the city, the tour guide is talking about all the buildings you're passing. And there's a couple like fun facts about zoning thrown in there. And specifically, one that I found really interesting, and I apologize, this is super specific to Chicago, but that's where I'm starting at, is there's this huge freeway that is called the Lakeshore Drive. It's right next to Lake Michigan. It's kind of a main north-south route in Chicago. Right next to it is all public land. There is a path where you can cycle, where you can walk, run. It's for the people. There's many parks along that path. There's many beaches along that path. It is for the people. So when Chicago was being planned, basically it was determined that this is not a area of any kind of commercial or industrial use. Like, this is specifically for the people. So if you wanted to build a residency or a business, no, you're not allowed to. This is specifically public space. With that in mind, it was kind of like zoning laws. This is, as an introduction, it's just public laws. It's public mandates for how this area is to be used. Specifically in Chicago, there's a huge portion that like this is used only for the people.
I didn't know that, but that area is really nice. I know
it's super nice.
We played tennis, and there's biking paths and beaches, and it's something that, you know, clearly is like high probably value land.
100%. It's probably incredibly valuable, and the fact that it is mandated for the people is like hugely beneficial. You see, if you go out anytime, especially during the summer, maybe a little less so in the winter, but it is packed with people. Like there's 16 tennis courts that are always being used, that are a mile away from me. And then if you go on the path, it's just absolutely packed with runners, bikers, walkers, people enjoying their Sunday afternoons, I feel like maybe let's take a moment to just describe what zoning is. I think when I was doing my research, I was definitely starting from square one. So I think it'd be helpful just to talk a little bit about what that actually means. So do you want to give a shot about what zoning is to you?
I'm definitely not an expert, but what I have found for zoning is it's a way for, let's just say, governments to dedicate specific areas of land to certain purposes. And from what I gathered, the originating reason that this was started is because you want to separate different kinds of activities, right? You don't want your power plant right next to your homes.
Right.
And you probably want your businesses like near homes and things like that, right? There's definitely a lot of history that goes along with bad use cases for how zoning has been used to like marginalize people or set up in ways that, discourage like different kinds of housing from, let's say like wealthier neighborhoods, that kind of thing.
Yep.
But I think the core principle when it was started, and I think when people are looking to like improve zoning laws now, still like works under the fact that you're trying to make certain types of businesses, industries, homes, industries like loaded within like certain locations to kind of like improve how like society like lives in that space.
Right, 100%. I found it's just essentially it's a way to organize the city. So you have this space is dedicated to residential, this space is dedicated to commercial, this space is dedicated to industrial or agricultural. Some cases where there's mixed like commercial and residential, there's laws there for what part of the city can be used for what type of purpose.
Yeah, and within that too, I don't know if this technically falls under zoning, but I think that's something that came up a lot within zoning are like mandates or regulations of things that go within different like types of zones. I think mostly what I'm talking about is residential.
Yep.
And there was just, I definitely want to hear Tyler's opinion because he has a lot more experience with it. But I think that there was a lot of interesting requirements, let's say, for like residential zoning, right? So, a lot of people probably notice areas with a lot of like single family homes and it's just like one house after another. And I'm always wondering like, oh, like why don't they build like a duplex or like an apartment building in these areas, right? Like, is it really best? And has no one wanted to build more than just like literally a single house on all of these lots? And what I learned is that there's a lot of these regulations, while not necessarily imposing that you couldn't build an apartment building, but because of different building code requirements or like size limits, it's just infeasible to build everything that you think you would be able to build in like a residential community.
Yeah, I think 100%. The other thing I wanted to mention, Paul, and this one is also a deep dive. This is not specific to the US. This is specific to Copenhagen, Denmark. And their biking infrastructure is incredible. So when I was living in Copenhagen, I picked up commuting via bike. It's a huge way of life there. Massive population opting to cycle for their commute. There was like a Wired article about the best bikeable cities, and Copenhagen was number one. Said 62% of the population of Copenhagen use biking to commute to either work, school.
That's a shocking number. Did you look up what the same stat is in the US by chance?
That's a great question. No, I don't know, but I guarantee it's way less than, it's under half for sure. I do have facts about the most and least bikeable cities.
I'm curious. What are they? What's the cliff notes at the least?
The cities with the most bikers in the US are Davis, California, Key West, Florida, Corvallis, Oregon, and Boulder, Colorado.
I'm trying to think if there's like a commonality between those, like if they're really flat. I'm just thinking about biking here in Seattle and it just being such a pain because of all the hills.
The hills, sure. Yeah. There's one commonality I can find, and that is Davis, California is home to UC Davis, Corvallis, Oregon is home to Oregon State, and Boulder, Colorado is home to the University of Colorado. So it could be college kids. Yeah, opting to bike. Yeah. But also those are like, just fantastic outdoor communities. So
yeah, you have to have both, right?
There's that too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would also add, Paul, do you want to know the least bike-friendly cities in the United States?
I'm hoping one of them isn't Seattle, but I doubt it's on there. It might be. Go ahead.
It's not. Seattle's not on there, so lucky you. But Chicago's not on there either, so I guess we're safe for a little bit. Yeah, but the least bikeable friendly cities, and we're already getting into my fun facts here. But the least bikeable friendly cities are Montgomery, Alabama, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Don't know if you've
never heard of it.
That's new to me.
I haven't passed through there on my journeys.
Pasadena, Texas, Jackson, Mississippi, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
I think it sounds like it's just too hot to bike.
Too hot to bike, and I think I can't speak directly to all those cities, but there's definitely a more of a culture of drive everywhere. Like everything is very spread apart, so you can drive to get to places, but biking, that's like probably significant distances. So I think that's probably part of it.
I was almost shocked that LA wasn't on there when you started saying like everything is drivable. Like it's like, imagine trying to bike on one of those freeways.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe LA should be on there. I'm not sure, but
They probably have a little more bike infrastructure. No, it's funny that you talk about biking. I think one of the things that I looked at a lot of when I was doing my research on this was about biking. I'm not really that big a biker, to be honest, but in Seattle, the reason that I was bringing it up is there are so many bikers, and with that comes a lot of the like bike lanes that they've built. 20 years ago, there was bike lanes were pushed against. Drivers were like, you're taking away my roads from bike lanes. All these bikers are trying to do like these crazy maneuvers on the roads, and they're going to get hurt, and I don't want to hit a biker, that kind of stuff.
I agree.
But I feel like they're really popular now, right? Like just in Seattle, I was in New York, and there's so many like dedicated bike lanes that I think they've been building over the years.
It's definitely not ubiquitous across the United States, but there is definitely cities that are pushing for more public usage, and including bike lanes, like so you can actually get from place to place without having to take your car. And I think Seattle lands in that.
I definitely want to talk about bike lanes on roads, but just to kind of talk about general biking things, one thing that I've been really lucky to live near a lot of my life are paths for bikes that are not on the road, just like general, like, through the woods, that kind of stuff. And I was learning that they really like to build them on old train lines.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, they convert old train lines into these bike paths because when they built the train lines, they had to flatten everything. So everything is like on a really like smooth grade. There's they have safety from obstructions like where they pass like cars or bodies of water, like short like rivers or streams. So they're really great for bike paths and like walking paths and stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting. There's one in Seattle, there's one in Durham, North Carolina, where I was just living. And I didn't realize that there were old train lines until I was looking it up and realized that's what they had been converting for so long.
That's really interesting. Okay, I didn't know that, but that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because it's too thin for cars, right? And it's obviously at like these weird places. So I thought that was a really great way to create a great space for like pedestrians and bikers. And, they tend to go through relatively populated areas, I think.
Paul, I might just hop in here. I did find some interesting history about zoning. Can I just shoot some dates at you here?
It's time for Hans's fun facts.
Not fun facts yet. This is history.
Okay, history facts.
History facts. I did see the very first instance of zoning was actually in Los Angeles in 1908.
Did they do like 90% of the city was freeways, or?
Going after LA today, man.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I just saw there was just a rule that you can't mix industrial and residential zones. That was all the rule was. That's the very first original usage of zoning. There was no map dedicated to this is commercial and this is industrial, but like we were talking about, it was really just saying, hey, if this spot of LA is being used for apartment buildings, then you can't put the power plant there, like we were talking about. The very first actual zoning map was used by New York City in 1916. So that's the very original usage of zone laws.
I can't really speak to how LA is laid out. I guess they didn't really have like that zoning law wasn't that, thorough. But yeah, that New York City one makes sense. I mean, it's obviously very structured, right? And I don't know if it's Manhattan that you were talking about, but just that general area is so structured in how it's built and how it's all used. So that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And it came about so New York was the first one to do that. In 1924, it was federally adopted. The Department of Commerce established zoning laws. So in this case, it was more of a federal regulation that states could then use to guide and adopt into their very own zoning laws. So New York did it first, and then I guess the rest of the United States kind of caught up after that. All right, Paul, can I hit you with some fun facts?
All right, thank God. Now it's time for Hans's fun facts.
You excited for the fun facts, man? I love bringing in the fun facts.
I'm always excited for the fun facts.
Okay. There is a major city in the United States that has no zoning laws. Do
I get to guess?
Sure, you can guess. I don't know. I've given you no clues, but you can, yeah.
I'm going to say LA.
It's not LA. It's not LA. It is.
All right, go ahead.
It's Houston, Texas. Has no zoning laws. Really surprised me because that is a massive city.
A huge city.
Yeah. And there was like kind of like they were kind of dancing around it. There's there's like ordinance codes that address how property can be subdivided, but the city codes themselves do not allegate land use. So I thought that was really interesting. It's a huge city. Kind of enigma that there's no zoning laws in Houston.
That's it. That must be a really interesting like use case on how it probably, if it like naturally like worked out in a certain way. I'm sure somebody's looked that up, but not I.
Yeah, there's someone do a research paper about that, please, because we need to find out why. Another fun fact for you, Paul. Being in Chicago, I'm gonna talk about Chicago some, but Chicago, obviously, this will be familiar to a lot of people, but it was essentially the entire city was destroyed in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire, right? And part of the reason that fire was able to overtake the entire city was because at the time, most of Chicago was built, all the structures were built on wood. So a farm out west caught fire. It was very windy that day. It brought the fire into the city. All the city is made of wood, and essentially that just completely demolished the entire city. So afterwards, Chicago started implementing zoning laws, which included the type of material that could be used for construction in order to avoid another Great Chicago Fire. So now in Chicago, you're not going to find a lot of wood buildings. And I assume that's true for most U.S. cities, but there's a very applicable reason for why these zoning laws are in place. In this case, it's to prevent another mass razing of a city. All right, we talked about biking. I got one more fun fact for you. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, give me the trio.
Okay. Researchers at Penn and Harvard have made an index for the cities with the most burdensome zoning laws for constructors. So if you want to build in this city, it is massively complicated. Do you want to know what cities those are?
Okay, I'm not going to give LA that one. God, I hope it's not LA. I would guess it's probably New York City. I feel like they would have a lot of stuff.
Ding, ding, ding. You are correct. 1 out of the 3 cities with the most burdensome zoning laws is, in fact, New York City. Makes sense.
That adds up.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. You talked about California. It's not LA, but is in fact
San Francisco.
It is San Francisco. Ding, ding, ding.
Hell yeah, I'm getting good at this.
2 for 2, man. Okay. All right, I got one more for you. This one I don't think you're going to get, but you can try.
Tallahassee, Florida.
Great guess. It's actually Providence, Rhode Island, is another incredibly difficult city.
They're basically the same place.
Yeah, Tallahassee and Providence, so much in common.
I hear a lot of similarities.
Yeah, so just through research, that's what I found. I love looking up, just random facts about geography, cities in the U.S., so I thought, that was fairly interesting. I will give a shout out to a couple of different resources I found. I know you mentioned Vox, and I think they do have some very great videos about zoning, so I want to give them a shout out. YouTube channel called City Beautiful. I love that YouTube channel. That guy is clearly so passionate about how cities are built, and I could just watch his videos endlessly because that was so fun to just see someone who's really good at what they're doing. I'll also give out another shout out to Planets and Courses. They just have a deep dive into the history about zoning. That's where I got my facts about LA and New York.
Hey, and tip your guides for the Chicago River Cruise.
And that's the big one. If you're ever in Chicago, take the Architecture Riverboat Tour. It is so much fun. The guides are incredibly knowledgeable. I swear I'm not sponsored by them. I just actually loved doing that. So
yeah, but after this, you'll see Hans being a guide. So
yeah, this is step 1 to being the guide of the Riverboat Tour.
Nice. Then why don't we bring on the man that's going to get us there? Yeah, now we'll want to introduce our friend Tyler. Tyler Labiak was a friend of Hans and I's in college. So welcome, Tyler. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me, Paul. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. You want to just quickly give yourself a little introduction?
Yeah, so I'm Tyler. I was friends with these guys in college, and I'm not particularly involved in politics or anything like that, but I think today I'm going to be talking about urbanism, which is very trendy. And I think if you've been kind of all over the internet, it's basically forced into a lot of young people's algorithms. I'm not an expert in that field or anything like that. I work as an engineer, but I was thinking about talking about it because I watch way too many YouTube videos, and that's how I got into it.
Yeah, that's perfect, Tyler. Yeah, me and Paul were talking about it, and out of the topics we've encountered so far, this was definitely one that we were starting at like square one. So, could you maybe just talk about what got you into urbanism and zoning?
Because I gotta say, it's definitely not naturally on my algorithm.
Yes, I'm with you there.
Okay, I guess I'm just deep in the rabbit hole. I was going through my YouTube subscription a little bit, and there's probably like 30 channels here, and some of them are small. But so basically, it's like urbanism is people who are interested in like decisions in city planning or transit policy or any of the above that is like it's focused on the urban form factor that's pre-suburban expansion. So I think the way that a lot of American people get exposed to it is like they study abroad in like Amsterdam or Copenhagen. Or like,
I did talk about Copenhagen earlier, Tyler.
they say like I had one popular figure says like you're either radicalized by Amsterdam or Tokyo, and I think that's true. If you travel to any like pre-car city, and in America that could be like Boston or Philadelphia or New York or Washington D.C. or any of the Rust Belt cities in the Midwest, or even some of the West Coast cities, but not Sun Belt. Basically, you might see like narrow streets and public transit and bike lanes and everything. So it's kind of just like advocacy in that direction. I got into it. I think I've traveled and I grew up between Philadelphia and New York, and I like those kind of environments. But I think most people got into it through one figure who is super popular and a little controversial, who is called Not Just Bikes.
Oh, interesting. Okay. That one didn't come up. Yeah, it was a YouTube channel.
Yeah, he's a YouTube channel. He has a podcast called The Urbanist Agenda, and he also has a YouTube channel, which I think he's the largest creator. He basically just was like one of these advocates. He's like a Canadian guy who moved to, I think, the Netherlands, and kind of just talks about like the differences in culture. And it's not just bikes, right? But like how everything, the housing, the street design, just like the culture even plays into like making this like urban fabric, which is like really pleasant. And, you can walk around and go to cute cafes, and neighborhoods are charming and mixed use and all that stuff.
So Tyler, could you give an example of where urbanism in the United States is done well? And maybe on the flip side where it's not done well?
Yeah, I would say like a couple things you're looking for is, of course, good public transit is the key. And I'd say like the main like call to arms of Not Just Bikes and these other people, but his main call to arms is that car-centric design of society is antisocial, unhealthy, like contributes to obesity because people aren't walking around and exercising. It's antisocial because people are spread apart. Kids can't walk around and be outside without, maybe the streets are more dangerous because there's traffic everywhere. It creates stress when people have to drive to work longer distances. So a big thing is public transit, of course, or bike lanes or walkability, and good. That's kind of like a hallmark of a good city for it. And by far, in a way, like in the United States, there's nothing that's in the same tier as New York City. But New York is also extremely expensive. And we can get into that as well. I think all the places that are the best, New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, etc., Chicago, they're all more expensive places to live than like a suburb in Texas, right? Like
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And to that point, right, like do you think that's a little bit because people like that kind of environment where you're a little bit more able to take like public transport, or is there like good public transport and all that thing, so many people have moved there that they've like built up like huge cities around them, right? Because you can be more compact than in like a suburban area.
It's a chicken or the egg situation. And I also, before I go further, I also want to say that it's not just humongous cities that have like quote unquote good urbanism. Like there are old small towns that have like a traditional main street where you can walk to different places and like neighborhood design that is actually like preferable. And we can get into all that as well. But I just think it's definitely a chicken or the egg, but people definitely do have a preference for this kind of living. And I think it is shown, like it's demonstrated by how expensive some of these places are to live. You know, if you look at some cities that don't have good public transit, like, I don't know, Texas cities, Houston, or some of the cities that have removed subways, like I think Buffalo or Rochester, it is definitely a chicken or the egg. Like, is Buffalo bad because it's just Buffalo and there's no reason to build a train in Buffalo, or is it bad because, or is there like no train in Buffalo because people don't want to live there? So it's definitely a mix.
Interesting you bring up Houston, because we did talk about it a little bit as one of the only major city in the United States that doesn't have zoning laws.
Yes. Yeah. So Houston's interesting. I think Houston has, and this kind of goes into like the role of planning too, but Houston's lack of zoning has made some weird situations where people say like, oh, Houston is just like an expanse of parking lots and office towers. But at the same time, Houston has housing that's like pretty unique. A big theme in this whole field is like not just its public transportation, but also the housing design. And you don't want to have basically single family housing that just expands forever. And typically in North America, like you'll have a downtown of skyscrapers, and then you'll have that surrounded by suburbs of single family home. And there's like this so-called missing middle where, you could have row homes, duplexes, small apartment buildings, or, other things that you might find in other countries abroad or in old American cities. Like, you might see the row homes in Philadelphia. So anyway, this is part of this like missing middle. And Houston, actually, because they don't have a lot of zoning, they do actually have a good amount of like unique housing solutions. Like maybe that's like an in-law suite. People are just like, putting a little cottage in their backyard, making a tiny home, making an in-law suite. You can more or less put an apartment building down in the middle of a neighborhood. So they actually do have good mixes, but the downside of that is it's a large city and it probably could do with a pretty good subway or improve over what do they have. I don't know what do they do have. They may have like a light rail or something. It's definitely not a comprehensive transit plan.
Yeah, talking about public transit, but what makes public transit good? Like you mentioned, Boston, Chicago, New York, San Francisco has functional public transport.
Yeah.
What makes it good transport?
I think that when you have there's this idea of like a lot of urbanists talk about induced demand. So let's just say that we have like hypothetical city that has like good jobs and the city wants to grow. So eventually the city people are driving into the city. Eventually the main roads, arterial roads, will start getting traffic. And now you have two choices. You can either, if you want to do a car-centric society, you can either add more lanes or you can divert and make public transit. But if you add more lanes, what will actually happen is this will cut the traffic and this will create the ability for people to build suburbs and subdivisions that are even further away. So this induces demand. Whereas let's say, before they expand the highway, it's a 2-lane highway, and getting from my suburb to downtown is 45 minutes. A lot of people aren't going to demand to do that. They're not going to want to drive into downtown. So more housing won't get built. But now if we say, okay, let's make this 2 lanes to 4 lanes, now it takes me 15 minutes to get downtown. So now we can go, more miles farther away, have more sprawl. This basically creates the suburban sprawl, the more lanes you add. And I think all the data around it shows that you cannot really beat traffic just by adding more lanes, because the more lanes you add, more growth will happen. Public transit, on the other hand, has such higher capacity in such skinnier area that you really can get way more people down a small right of way, right? Like imagine the capacity of a heavy rail just going into a city versus what's the same space taken up by a highway, I don't know, 6 lanes. Like, is one train line, the red line in DC, would that have to be replaced by a 6-lane highway to get all those commuters to the National Mall? Probably, right? And do you want a 6-lane highway with all the pollution and everything that comes with it? Probably not. So I think that's where public transit sits. And like I said, you don't need to be a major city with public transit to have good urbanism. You can definitely be a small town and do different things right.
That's really interesting about the subway thing. I've noticed that like a lot of people talking about the like increase in lanes like causing more cars, but I didn't realize that like it does the opposite. Like if you put like public transit,
the more lanes you have, the more people will demand to live further away because there's less traffic and now there's more cars on the same road. So yeah, I guess it's really just a capacity thing. If you think about it, you can always add more cars to a train, and it's just stacked out like just getting longer, right? There's other transit solutions that aren't just trains. Like you can imagine if you took one highway lane and replaced it by a dedicated bus lane. Like I used to live in Baltimore, and there was a lot of bus only lanes. You know, those buses are filled with 50 people during like commuting hours. And what would 50 cars look like, right? Like the amount of traffic, 50 cars can't squeeze through like one traffic light in like a 90-second cycle. But like one bus with 50 people can like easily fit through, and way less emissions, way less destructive on the neighborhood. So yeah, so that's transit.
Kind of going back to the discussion with like that middle ground between your like high rises and single family homes. One of the things that I found like really interesting as I was like looking up some of like the zoning laws was like what forces that divide. And I was wondering if there were any like in particular that you thought like either had like a really big influence on why we have like a lot of single family homes, or like weird, what I'm going to describe as like consistent like apartment structure buildings, or one that you think that like people like don't necessarily like know about.
Yeah, I'll say starting with the single family zoning, the big thing in America is zoning is exclusionary. So you'll have this area is for industrial, this area is for residential, and this area is for apartment buildings, etc. If you compare that to another country like Japan, the zoning is like basically like a pyramid. So it will be like this zoning, this area is for residential. This next area is for residential plus apartment buildings, or like single family plus apartment buildings. Then the next layer is single family plus apartment buildings plus commercial. So every layer includes the lower layers below it. So there's really no area that's excluding people from adding housing. So definitely exclusionary zoning is like the big, broad, overarching reason of why in America you have like a city with a downtown with towers, and then you go out 15 minutes outside the city and you just have like neighborhoods. In terms of, I think what you're alluding to is like this idea of why every apartment building in America looks the same, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which we can talk about. I'm sure I think maybe you're going to talk about like elevator regulations, buildings have to have 2 stairs, etc. Maybe that's something you want to get into, but
yeah, well, it was I do kind of want to get into it, and it was reminded of me because earlier Hans and I were talking about how Chicago has these interesting building laws because of like the large fire that like basically destroyed Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I remember hearing that a lot of those like regulations, I think the one specifically that you even linked to me was something about like having to have 2 stairs.
Yeah.
In every apartment complex was due to a lot of like areas having like these big fires and people needing like multiple escape routes. I don't know if that's the only reason why, but
definitely. I think it even goes like American cities, like a lot of them are like built out of timber, but like compare that to like some medieval city that's built out of stone, right? So it's like, one, cities are newer, and 2, they were timber, so they were able to burn down. So I think when they were developing a lot of zoning rules and fire regulations, they required apartments to have 2 staircases, which is kind of why every single apartment building in America that you see, unless you live in an old building 100 years old or something, will be like this 5/1. It'll have 2 staircases, 1 hallway. It might be like an L shape. And then it'll have units on every other side because they need windows, and you need like fire escapes and windows for those fire codes. Now, do we probably need that still in America now? Like, are we at a big risk of widespread fires, like razing cities to the ground? Probably not, right? Like we could probably get away with, a cute 3-story apartment building with like 1 staircase in the middle. So that's definitely one big thing. And a recent one, I was just in Croatia, and before we got to Croatia, I read an article about elevators in America, and I was talking to my family about it, and we were all joking about it. Anyway, the article said that in some places in Europe, elevators can be like 10 times cheaper than elevators in America. And this just allows you to build like so many more like interesting things because, you can have like wheelchair accessible, small like 3-story flats with an elevator and like this and that. Why is that the case? Basically because of like unions, regulations, et cetera, et cetera. But when we got to Croatia and we got to our hotel, I kid you not, like we got into one of the smallest elevators I've ever seen in my life. Like you could fit no more than 2 people inside of it. But that's good. Like a small elevator is a good thing for like for enabling all different types of housing, right? You don't need to have like this very expensive, very big elevator. I think what started off in America was like you needed to fit a stretcher on the elevator. And then it was like you need to fit a stretcher plus people on each side of the stretcher in the elevator. And then you need to have weight limits and there's fire regulations. So you won't find as many unique housing solutions with staircases or elevators. And it sounds less safe, but this stuff's kind of outdated, and I don't really think we're at risk of fire burning down most of our cities anytime soon.
Do you in all these like content creator areas that you like watching, are they pushing for like less regulations, like changing of regulations? Like what's the, I guess, like fix or like proposed solutions to like some of these problems that you're seeing? And do you think they're like, is anyone actually talking about them in the mainstream? Like, are any of these things going to change?
So yeah, maybe we can get into some of these content creators and their drama.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Okay, so the first guy that I was talking about, Not Just Bikes, he was criticized by a lot of these other people because he basically had a series of tweets that are now deleted that was like, North America is completely hopeless and there's too much momentum behind these problems. If you can get out, just get out. Like if you want to be in an urban environment, just leave.
Okay.
And a lot of people like took really harshly to that. This one guy, Alan Fisher, who's like based out of Philadelphia, and he always talks about like, it's like local efforts. Like, can we like improve this trail, this like bike trail, and get like, some curbs added to it in like this neighborhood in West Philadelphia? Like that's the kind of like scale of activism that he's like, it's local politics, right? And they used to be friends. They used to be on podcasts together. They don't speak to each other anymore over these tweets.
Whoa.
Jesus.
That was one. And then there's all these creators. Another guy who's pretty popular is called City Nerd. And he makes videos that are really popular, and it'll just be like top 10 lists, like top 10 most affordable cities with like good bike lanes or something. And this guy is big on like city visits, and every city he'll go to, he'll like link the local transit groups. Like you need to get through, like for example in DC, like there's a Connecticut Avenue bike lane that's been like wavering in the legislature, and people are trying to advocate for it. And then the people who live there are like, no, we don't want it because it's going to create extra traffic. And anyway, back and forth. But like he'll link to an organization that's like backing it. So I think some of them do a good job. And maybe I'm just talking all over the place, but there was one creator who is not an urbanist, but he's like me. He just watches all these videos. He's not like an activist or anything. And he's like has a YouTube gaming channel or something. And this guy came in with like probably the most scathing critique of like urbanist content that I've seen so far, where he was like, these people just complain. They don't offer any real solutions. Like they need to be more political. Like he was basically saying like, this is an inherently political thing. Like you can't do this without advocating for candidates and like getting laws changed. And then it was a huge thing where like other channels were reacting, like watch his video, make a commentary, and live stream over it. So I'd say it is like a fairly political space, and people kind of levy criticism at each other. I think your original question was like, what can you do? And a lot of people would just point to one advocacy group called Strong Towns. They also have a YouTube channel, and they are like sort of the OGs in this space, but they also get a lot of criticism. But they do have they have a local chapter in like all cities. So if you live in like Chicago, you can go to like the Strong Towns Chicago chapter. They'll have like maybe like bi-weekly meetings where they'll talk about like, grassroots organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's kind of on the local level, I think.
Yeah, are a lot of these like laws and stuff like very local then?
Yeah, they are. I mean, they're of course like for big things like advocating for like high-speed rail, like the Biden Infrastructure Act and California high-speed rail. These things happen at the national level, and I think the engagement you're limited to at the national level is basically what candidate you pick. And in this election, I think there's one candidate that has basically said they want to protect single-family zoning and defund transit. So that's basically the extent of the involvement that you can do at the national level. But in terms of things like advocating for bike lanes or protected crosswalks or zoning reform, that's stuff that basically happens like in a very grassroots way, I think.
Talking about these like content creators and just people in general in the zoning space, is there any form of activism that has been deemed and is wholeheartedly agreed upon like this was successful?
Yeah, I have a couple. So one of the big, easy, low hurdles to cross is removing parking minimums. So parking minimums, from what I understand, are basically like heavily lobbied for by car manufacturers when suburbia was created after World War II. And it was like, okay, we're going to rip up the streetcars and everyone's going to drive a Ford. And since everyone's going to drive a Ford, we need to have parking lots everywhere. And this is kind of like, this is like the most anti-urban thing possible. Like spread everyone out as far as possible. You can't walk anywhere because there's parking moats everywhere. And there are cities that have totally peeled back. Like I think Minneapolis, San Francisco. I'm not sure. Maybe I feel like one of the first cities was like in New Mexico who repealed parking minimums. But this is just like an easy thing you can do because if you don't have parking, everyone's been to like a shopping mall that has just like a moat of parking lots around it. Like that could be converted to housing. That could be made into a million different things. And I think it's very tied. There's so much I could talk so much, but I think it's very tied to like the housing crisis too, because when you have more space developed dedicated to parking, you have less room to build housing. When you have constrained housing supply, housing costs go up. And Minneapolis, who actually got rid of parking minimums, and they have probably one of the most pro-development mindsets. They are one of the few cities in America that actually saw rents decrease in the years following the pandemic, when there was inflation all over America, and cities like Austin or something were seeing doubling of rents. Minneapolis actually removed parking minimums and built so much housing during that time that they were actually to bring rent down. I think that kind of shows that, when you actually do build stuff and, increase supply, the basic laws of supply and demand do actually hold. And that's probably one of the biggest things that's proven is like build as much housing as possible, remove parking minimums, advocate for transit. These things are like, I would say, universally advocated for across all people.
So with Minneapolis, are we we're labeling them as a successful example of urbanism reform?
Yeah, like in recent years.
In recent years, yeah. Is this coming from local initiatives, like you were saying? Is it from city initiatives, state initiatives? Any kind of federal help? Like who was involved to make this successful?
Ooh, I don't know the whole story with Minneapolis in particular, but I know for a fact that there is like, I think that is a local law that's happening to like for the parking minimums in particular. And also like permitting for building housing is also a local issue. So I'm not sure who it is, but I don't think it's not Joe Biden removing parking minimums in Minneapolis. It's either state or city people. That's a good question. I'd be curious like exactly what groups are behind it. I think like some examples of successful urbanism that you can like really point a finger to would come from the Strong Towns group. Like they are basically a consultancy nonprofit that will like come to a city or town and they will say like, okay, you can put this and this measure in place and you're going to see like pedestrian fatalities decrease and you're going to see like city revenues raise because this and that reason. And they have like, if you go on their website or like connect with that organization, you will see like examples where they're like, oh, we implemented this change in Albuquerque and we implemented this change in Asheville, North Carolina. So you can definitely point fingers to it, but it is more nebulous, I think.
Do you want to switch gears?
Sure.
Sure.
Well, one of them that I was thinking about when you were talking about like transitioning like parking lots in like super mega malls into housing is kind of like that. I think it's called like mixed use or like where you have the like a shop on the bottom and like housing on the top.
Sure.
Is that like a contentious theme that cities try to implement? Because like I love it when it's like you're in a small town, you're like on like a main street and there's like a mom and pop shop on the bottom and then there's like 2 apartments above it. But I don't find it that common outside of like really big cities where, obviously like it's just a huge apartment that has like a single, store at the bottom, or in those like really like quaint towns.
Regarding like mixed use development, small town or large town, you're right, Paul. Like, when I lived in like Riverside in Baltimore, it's like at least 100-year-old neighborhood. And there's like corner bars, little bodegas, little places to get your hair cut that are just like below apartments or like a little house. Like I used to live above a mortgage place and across the street was more apartments that were 2 stories that were above like an ice cream store. That was like my favorite place in Baltimore. So yeah, but these places, obviously, they predate like the suburban experiment. It is contentious, certainly. Maybe you guys have heard the term NIMBY, which is like the NIMBY is like the evil villain of urbanism, and it's not in my backyard. So these are the
Oh,
people
sure.
who are like, they show up at council meetings, and it's like, good example would be in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Georgetown, Washington, D.C. is super populous and has so many destinations, and there's a university, there's fabulous restaurants, there's bars, there's shopping, but there's no metro stop. Why is that? It's because every time that they've tried to put a metro stop in, and there's a metro line that goes under, but there's no stop. It's because the people who live in Georgetown, who are like predominantly wealthy, they want to preserve the character of their neighborhood, quote unquote, and they won't let the metro stop be built. They go to town meetings and zoning meetings and they protest it. And I think a little bit of it could be rooted in like classism or racism at times, but also it could be historical preservation, but that's often weaponized for the same ends of like classism and racism. You know, we don't want those people coming here on the subway. Or in the case of like an apartment building, right? You know, we don't want to have this low income, potentially low income housing apartment building in our area. Like, let's say we live in Berkeley, California, right? And my house built in 1970s worth $3 million, and everyone wants to live in Berkeley. But should we build an apartment there? No. Why? It's going to block our view, right? So they'll weaponize different things like laws about like sea views and preserving historical character and everything else to have a NIMBY movement, like not in my backyard. And anyway, that's like the villain. So there's definitely pushback. You can imagine like your typical homeowner boomer. And part of the reason they do that is because like if supply is constrained, their value's going up, right? So if I present mixed use development for getting built in my single family neighborhood, and my single family neighborhood is in like a super desirable area, the price of my house is going to go up. So the price of my investment is directly tied to limiting as much building as possible. And whether that's transit or mixed use development. Paul, I wanted to go back to what you're talking about, this idea of like a mom and pop shop underneath your house, or like a storefront, or even just like a small business out of your home. My mom was telling me recently, because we had these conversations all the time in my family. She wanted to buy some cookies, and she went to like this little house and went inside, and inside every single surface of the house was covered in cookies. And she thinks it's great, and she's like buys the cookies, and she starts talking to the lady, and this lady's like super popular on Etsy, but she's at the point where she is like totally limited by capacity. And if she wants to bake more cookies and expand her business, she needs to move basically and buy like something that's zoned for like a restaurant or a bakery. Like she cannot add, I guess, more ovens, more exhaust fans, more kitchen equipment into her home, because that's just how her neighborhood's zoned, and that's how her state or city does it. And for her, it's prohibitively expensive. She's like, I can't make the leap to get a lease in like basically like a bakery. So she can't slowly grow her business, and she's basically bottlenecked. There are some places that are kind of trying to like change this dynamic. And of course, if you're in a major city, you know, you might be able to open a business anywhere. But this is just like a suburb in Pennsylvania. But
some way to bridge the gap.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So there's one kind of like interesting neighborhood. It's built in Tempe, Arizona. It's called the Cul-de-sac, and it was built as like this like walkable, like car-free neighborhood where anyone could. There were like these houses were built with like a storefront in the bottom already, and it was like going to be everything you need. And I guess it kind of remains to be seen how that's going to play out, because I've heard the people who have moved in at first are like really unhappy because it's not filled with amenities yet. So it remains to be seen if that can be a proven model of like a pre-built modern way of having housing and businesses combined. Other than that, I think other than building something from scratch, I think it's really just a zoning issue, and just going to those zoning meetings and just like fighting NIMBYs and being like, oh yeah, we want to be able to have a small business here, right? Like, why does our town's law say that I can't have a commercial oven, right, in this neighborhood? Like, what so that, I think that's kind of the crux of it, unless you're going to go for something radical like that cul-de-sac neighborhood.
I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned during your NIMBY discussion, and it was kind of related to keeping like historic buildings. And I was thinking about how like when we lived in Charlottesville, you know, there's a lot of like historic areas like tied to Thomas Jefferson, and I'm sure there's like a bunch of stuff like everywhere where, you know, one historical thing happened and now it's like a preserved area, or things have to be built in a certain way to like match a certain style. And I was curious if you've like seen any discussions or like thought about at what point does that change? Like, how long are we willing to like keep these historic things, especially as like housing has become like more scarce, like kind of anything in that realm?
That's actually like one of the most delicate parts of this is like you could be total, like there are some people who are total YIMBY who are basically just like a libertarian mindset where it's like, oh yeah, like build anything anywhere at any cost, put in the middle of Venice, should we put like a 50-story apartment tower because housing in Venice is expensive? And maybe for a lot of people the answer to that is no, right? Because it's like we don't want to destroy Venice. Venice is beautiful. We don't want to Manhattanize Venice. And there's definitely been, I've heard in like European cities, like Paris, I think, where certain areas get built up, or London or something, where people are like, we don't want to Manhattanize this area by just like adding like as much housing as possible. So there's a balance between, adding like a 50-story apartment tower in something that's truly like historical and beautiful and something that you want to preserve culturally. And then the opposite end of that is like people in like Southern California getting their like golf course plus gated community that was built in like just like 1965 determined like a historical landmark just because they want to weaponize like that law against extra development because the housing supply is so constrained. And California is like the typical like evil NIMBY example where there's so much demand to live there. Housing costs are so high, but they just build like a comically low amount of housing. I think it's getting better recently, but
don't worry. I was crapping on LA
yeah
a lot earlier, so I'm glad that it held up.
They have there's like a law now, so it's like basically if certain municipalities don't add a certain number of housing units in California, the state government will step in and take like a bunch of different steps. Like I think one of them is like permits to build will be limited to a certain amount of days before they automatically get approved. So this is basically the state saying like, okay, like Huntington Beach, I know you guys think that you're like a historical area, but we need to actually put like some apartments here, or like just some, they're not even have to be apartments. Like I know you're thinking like a tower, but like maybe just like row homes, right? Or maybe just like a duplex, right? We need to do something to densify this area a little bit. And already like a bunch of these places have had to have the state stepped in because in the first like year or so they did not meet, like they in the first time frame to meet the mandates, they did not meet it. I think San Francisco added something like in the teens of housing units since this law was passed, and they needed to add like 20,000 units or something. Don't quote me on that, but they needed to add like thousands or hundreds of units, and they added like 15 units. So now the state is getting to kind of like take over their local zoning in certain aspects. So yeah, I don't even remember what the question was, but it's definitely interesting the situation with like zoning and the housing crisis in particular.
Yeah, no, I feel like that answered my original question. It was mostly on just like, has there been much discussion on like historical preservation?
I'll say one like hilarious example in Baltimore, which is like, if you know anything about Baltimore, the biggest problem in Baltimore is urban blight, because Baltimore used to be, I think, like the third largest city in America at one point, had well over 1 million residents, and now it has like 500,000 or 600,000 residents. So there's entire swaths of Baltimore that are just like abandoned, like crumbling row homes and like streets that every like 4 out of 5 houses will be boarded up, and like, trees growing, similar to what you saw in Detroit in like the early 2000s, where it would be like, oh, it's just like rubble, right? That's a lot of Baltimore in the 21st century, and it is turning around, of course. But people will still like say like, oh, we need to preserve this. Like there was this building that had like a brick facade, and the building was nothing. The city owned it, so it wasn't like anyone was really doing anything in there. The city owned it because they seized it from somebody during this like whole urban blight and white flight movement, and it was like a big post-industrial brick facade, and someone wanted to redevelop it into housing apartment buildings. And they were like, you need to keep the exterior being this windowless brick facade on like one side because it's historical and it's like 100 years old. And like at some point, the developer was like, we need to walk away from this because it was so prohibitively expensive to keep what Baltimore asked them to keep that they ended up just losing the developer. I've seen some interviews with people in like Portland, for example, where the historical preservation and zoning rules, and you need to have this many affordable units, and like the restrictions on building are so high that there's no profit incentive to build at all. And what ends up happening is the housing crisis gets worse. yeah, I mean, Portland is different than Baltimore. It's hilarious that this is happening in Baltimore because it's like we literally have abandoned homes everywhere. Why are we why are we worried about preserving this like abandoned post-industrial building that is like falling apart anyway? So there's a balance, and of course, and truly like the other side of it is like something like I said, like I was just in Dubrovnik. It's like King's Landing from Games of Thrones, and people who live there are completely priced out because because it's like a World Heritage Site. It's like this old city. It's beautiful. It's a medieval city. No one can really afford to live there anymore, except for like Russian billionaires. But at the same time, the government's not going to go ahead and say, "Oh, well, we can make it more affordable," and we'll just start adding some duplexes everywhere. So there's two sides to the historical and zoning preservation stuff.
So Tyler, I would say the theme of this podcast, right, is jumping into a hobby or a passion, something you really care about, discussing that every week. Can you just give a plug for what you would want the listeners to know about urbanism? What would be your bottom line here?
If you care about not exposing your children to particulate matter from tires that are going to give them asthma, if you care about affordable housing, if you care about being able to walk to a few different coffee shops within like a quick radius, if you care about not having traffic in the morning on the way to work, all of these things, public transit, bike accessibility, building more housing and different types of housing, whether that's not just apartment buildings and single family homes, but duplexes and, low-rise flats and et cetera, et cetera. If you care about all these things, try to get involved with, even if you're just like consuming the content, which is how like basically what I do. Like you can basically radicalize yourself like I have. And then this is going to be all you're going to think about when it's time to like vote in your local election. You're going to be Googling like who's the most bike, who wants to put the bike lane on the Connecticut Avenue when you're voting for like your local representative. So that's the pitch. It is, like I said, it is slightly political, but I don't think that the lines are at the local level. I don't think the lines are like super party aligned. And I think, this stuff happens in local meetings and primaries, and it happens at a super small grassroots level a lot of the time. So, get involved.
Cool. Thank you, Tyler. Just before we go, do you have anything you want to plug personally, or any other creators you want to shout out specifically? Yeah,
I'll plug a bunch of them.
Sure.
Alan Fisher, this guy, he likes trains and Philly. Alexander Rotmans, this guy, he has like 10,000 subscribers. He'll just put like sad classical music and just show like pre-war Midwestern cities and like how beautiful they were, and then just like a highway that just like tears through like 10 neighborhoods. Pretty funny. Of course, there's City Nerd is like a super sardonic former transit engineer who like just does like top 10 lists, and like he gets a little sassy and political sometimes. There's a different guy, if you're interested in like more the academic side, there's a guy named City Beautiful. He's a professor from like a small California city, or maybe like a medium California city, and he just talks about this stuff from like he's a real professor of urban planning. About Here is good for Canadians. Oh, I wanted to plug this one Canadian. I don't know if they're not going to be watching this, but if they were, there's a Montreal, I think, based Canadian YouTube channel that they basically take an angle of like they're super meta, because they'll be like, urbanists are saying this, but here's the real. So it's like this is the second layer deep of like, oh, you've been watching the base content, get on our content, we're going to criticize that a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know what they're called, but I'll try to find it. But anyway, yeah, just if you just go on, and then of course Not Just Bikes, that's like the starter pack where he'll just like radicalize you a little bit. But
perfect. The starter pack that'll radicalize you. Yeah, okay. That's a good
pitch. He calls it, he has like an orange logo, and he calls it taking the orange pill. And he's like, well, once you take the orange pill, like you're just gonna be like raging in traffic.
Okay. Great. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Hopefully, I feel like I was just kind of rambling, so hopefully hopefully everyone learned something.
Definitely learned some good stuff. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of This Week I'm Into. Huge thank you to Tyler Labiak for sharing his passion on urbanism and zoning. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for the next episode, please reach out at thisweekiminto@gmail.com, and please give us a follow on Instagram at thisweekiminto. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. And now a word from our sponsors, but legally, they don't actually sponsor us.
You know, Hans, since I had just moved to Seattle, I've been touring a bunch of different apartments looking for a place to live. It's amazing how they all follow exactly the same layout, with long corridors and windows all on one side. I'm getting tired of it, and I'm in the need of some new kind of housing solution.
Well, what are you going to do?
Hey everyone, are you like me and looking for the perfect place to call home or make a smart investment?
Excited about having your own yard, being near great neighbors, and having a garage? It's perfect for families, young professionals, or anyone looking to maximize their living situation.
Owning property can provide greater financial stability. It's a great way to build wealth through real estate. Property values appreciate over time, so what's better than one house? Two! Let us introduce you to this week's non-sponsor, Owning a Duplex.
Wait, did you say duplex, Paul? You can't build those here. It's zoned for single-family homes.
Yes, a duplex offers the best of both worlds. You live in one unit, you rent out the other, helping you pay off the mortgage faster and generate extra income.
Whoa. Not in my backyard. I spent months convincing the government that my house, built last year, is a historic landmark because I found a penny with Abraham Lincoln on it during construction, and he's a historic figure.
Hey, Hans, this is supposed to be an ad in support of different housing solutions.
There's no way I'm supporting that. I already had to deal with that bike lane they added on our block. What am I supposed to do with these 3 cars I need parking for?
Oh crap, Hans, look out! Well, have you ever needed to find an organization that can help local governments build bike lanes in your community? Check out this week's non-sponsor, Strong Towns, at strongtowns.org.
Results may differ.